Okay, so this is a recorded lecture of Life, Death and Morality's sixth installment on arguments. It's a recorded lecture because I will be on strike this Wednesday. And if you'd like to know why the NTEU will be on strike, well then have a look at the NTEU, the National Tertiary Education Union's webpage. If you want to know why strikes are important, well that's a longer conversation. But I am, as much as I'm committed to strike action, I'm also committed to teaching you as well as I can. And I'm very sorry to not be giving a lecture in person this week. So to make up for it, as you can see there, I will have extended consultation hours from 10 till 1 on Thursday, should you be worried about anything in Assessment Task 2, or should anything in this lecture recording be unclear to you. Okay, so this is the lecture outline. This is what we're going to do. First of all, I'm going to start off with a recap of self-defense because it's directly relevant to, again, Assessment Task 2 that you've got due this Friday, April 12 at 5 p.m. And again, I have extended consultation hours so that you can discuss AT2 with me should you be having any problems with it. And then we'll talk about the evaluation of arguments, which is what this week 6 is about. But I want to make sure that we get self-defense down, and I don't feel like I really drew out the differences between Thompson's account and Otsuka's account in lecture last week, so I want to return to that and try and get that as clear as possible for you. Okay, so AT2 has this question. Now, you're not to answer the question right away. As you know, if you look at the task sheet for Assessment 2, we're asking you to approach this question through 4 sub-questions, helping you to break down or approach answering an essay question like this in a structured and ordered way. So the question is, do you think that there is a morally relevant distinction between killing an innocent aggressor and killing an innocent bystander in self-defense? Explain why not? Justify your answer with reference to the prescribed readings. Excuse me. There are 2 positions here. First is Thompson's permissive rights-based theory, and that is, you're asked to address that, although I don't think it mentions Thompson's name as such, in question 2 of Assessment Task 2. And then you're asked to look at Michael Otsuka's restrictive rights-based theory, his counter-argument to Thompson, in question 3 of AT2. So again, I want to get clear on what these 2 scholars, these 2 philosophers are saying. So Thompson's rights-based account, the condition for determining whether or not we're able to act in self-defense, use self-defensive violence, is the following. If you don't harm X, X will infringe your right to life. The theory is, whenever the condition is true of someone, you may harm them in self-defense. Okay, so although you don't have to write about this in your assessment task, what this does is enables Thompson to get around the problem of what we might call the free-for-all. So if you remember our example of Mr. Red and Mr. Yellow, Mr. Red has fired his missiles first, and Mr. Yellow then retaliates justifiably in self-defense. But on Thompson's initial account, there'd be nothing at this point stopping Mr. Red from saying, well, hang on, now I'm being attacked, so I can use self-defensive violence against Yellow, even though I started it. What difference the rights-based account makes is that if Red attacks Yellow first, he forfeits his right to life. In this picture, you see the shield represents our right to life, and Red has forfeited his by firing first. And of course, you can see again, he's really happy about it. He's got his arms up in the air. He's celebrating his reckless attack on Yellow. On the rights-based account, Yellow can then defend himself against Red without threatening to infringe Red's right to life because Red doesn't have one anymore. Now, this is just a recap from last week. It's not directly relevant to AT2, but this is. So Thompson wants to say that innocent bystanders and innocent shields do not meet the rights-based condition. So the bystander and the shield are merely in the presence of something or someone, that threatens to infringe your right to life. Just to go over it again, the bystander is, of course, someone who just happens to be on the scene. In the examples that Thompson and Otziker give, it's someone standing on a narrow bridge over a ravine that you might want to push over in your attempt to escape the violent aggressor, the villainous aggressor, I should say. All aggressors are violent. When I make a mistake like that, I know I need either lemonade or tea. Probably both. An innocent shield is someone who, unfortunately, wrong place, wrong time, has been used in some way by the villainous aggressor to deflect or mitigate or lower the possibility of defensive violence. So, in our example, someone's strapped to the front of the madman's car who's relentlessly pursuing you over an open field. Now, Thompson's point is that the bystander and the shield are merely in the presence of something or someone that threatens to infringe your right to life. So because they are not themselves threatening to infringe your right to life, you're not permitted to harm them in self-defense. But on Thompson's account, innocent threats and innocent aggressors do meet the rights-based conditions. The threat and the aggressor, even though they are innocent, do threaten to infringe your right to life. So what's a threat? In the example, the threat is someone who's lost control of their body. They've been flung off the cliff by the wind through no fault of their own, and they're going to fall on you. You're at the bottom of the ravine, and you're going to break their fall. They'll live and you'll die. The innocent aggressor, on the other hand, is someone who's had their coffee, I'd prefer tea, spiked in the morning, and has, through no fault of their own, obviously they didn't spike their own tea, we've ruled that out. Someone else has spiked their tea, and as a result they've flown into a violent rage and are threatening to hack you to pieces with a machete or a carving knife. Now, Thompson thinks that both the threat and the aggressor, even though they're innocent, are threatening to infringe your right to life, and therefore we're permitted to harm them in self-defense. In Otziker's example, we have a ray gun and we can shoot the person, disintegrate them rather, the person who's about to fall on us at the bottom of the ravine. The aggressor, we can take whatever violent actions we need to disarm the threat that they're posing, even if that means killing them. And the worry is that this might be too permissive, because on Thompson's account, genuinely innocent parties can be harmed. We might worry about harming an innocent. Certainly Otziker does, and this is his rights-based account, his alternative and more restrictive account. So on page 148 of your reader, Otziker seeks to establish the moral equivalence of innocent bystanders, shields, and threats. The argument, and I went through it last week, runs something like, if it is wrong to kill innocent bystanders in self-defense, and Thompson agrees, then it is wrong to harm innocent shields in self-defense, and Thompson agrees, and Thompson doesn't agree to this, it is wrong to harm innocent threats. It's also wrong to harm the person whose body has become a threat because they've been blown off a cliff or equivalent. For Otziker, what all of these cases share, the bystander, the shield, and the threat, in their innocence, is a lack of response or lethal agency. That is, they haven't evinced or evidenced moral agency in their action such that they would be responsible for any lethality, any threat to life that they might, in their body or in their presence, cause. So Otziker's theory runs something like, if you don't harm X, X will be morally responsible for infringing your right to life. And whenever the condition is true of someone, you may harm them in self-defense. And he thinks neither bystanders nor shields nor threats are morally responsible for infringing your right to life. They lack responsible lethal agency. In short, they just didn't mean to threaten your right to life. It's not their fault. And if they are threatening your right to life through their presence in some way, their bodily presence, that's not a morally relevant fact. Okay, then we have Otziker on innocent parties, right? So on page 148 and 149 of your reader, Otziker makes an extra step. I don't think I got this clear last week. Otziker argues that if innocent threats are not morally responsible, then neither are innocent aggressors. And And Thompson certainly doesn't agree to that. So the key idea is that innocent threats and aggressors are, from a moral perspective, equivalent to innocent bystanders and shields. All right, so if you think back to the question you've got for AT2, we're really at the heart of it here. So for Otsuka, the innocent threat and the innocent aggressor are simply in the presence of something that will harm you. It's just that in their case, so they're in the presence of something that will harm you, just as the bystander and the shield is or are. The bystander just happens to be in the presence of a threat situation. The shield, very unfortunately, just happens, through no fault of their own, to be strapped to the threat, to the murderous vehicle rampaging across the field. It's just that in the case of the aggressor and the threat, the something that is threatening to infringe your right to life is their own body. But they didn't mean to put their body in the situation where it would threaten to infringe your right to life. So at an extreme, we might say that the threat and the aggressor are like bystanders in their own body, or their minds are like shields strapped to the weapon of their body. So imagine if someone spikes your tea with a drug that causes you to fly into a violent rage in your body, but nonetheless your mind, your intelligence, stays perfectly clear so that you can witness every action that your body is compulsively undertaking, even though you don't intend any of it. In that case, you're much like the poor person who's been blown off the cliff, the innocent threat. You're blown off the cliff and you have to watch your body threaten to crush the person at the bottom of the ravine. But you have no responsible lethal agency, you have no intent to harm that person. So to compare Otsuka and Thompson, we might ask, under what conditions does a threat forfeit the right to life? Well, Thompson, there shouldn't be a P there, I apologise. Whenever the person threatens to infringe your right to life, and innocent threats and aggressors do so threaten to infringe your right to life. And this is permissive in the sense that we can harm innocence in self-defense. Otsuka's claim is that whenever the person is morally responsible for threatening to infringe your right to life, well then they forfeit the right to life and we can enact defensive violence against them. The difference is that for Otsuka, innocent threats and aggressors, so the person blown off the cliff, the poor person with the spiked coffee, are not morally responsible. They don't intend to harm you. They're just unfortunate. And the fact that their bodies are out to harm you is not a morally relevant fact. Oops. So this position is restrictive in the sense that we cannot harm innocence for Otsuka, even when their own body threatens to infringe our right to life. And we might ask, well, is that too restrictive? Because what it means is that if I'm threatened, let's take the limit case, the extreme case of the aggressor, I have to say, no, I'm not allowed to shoot this person or disarm this person violently, whatever that would take. I wouldn't know the first thing to do when setting out to disarm someone. You have to think to yourself, well, this person's had their coffee spiked this morning, and let's just presume that that's something that you're able to know. Let's say you do know that. Well, I'm not able or in a position to harm them. They have not forfeited their right to life because they are in this act, this violent act, not evidencing or do not possess a responsible lethal agency. They're not morally responsible for what their body's doing. And that's restrictive. It's also a very high standard. So it's restrictive in the sense we can't harm that person. It also puts humans under a lot of duress. I mean, it's hard to imagine that we would refrain from harming the person who comes at us with a knife. And so we might like to think, and the reader goes on to say this, that individuals who do harm an innocent aggressor in self-defense might be excusable in their violation of that innocent's right to life. That violation might nonetheless be excusable. Okay, so I hope that's helped with AT2. And now we'll go on to arguments, which is what this week 6 is about proper. Okay, so in the pre-lecture video, we looked at how to recognize arguments and how to represent them in standard form. If you haven't looked at these at the pre-lecture video yet, I strongly encourage you to just pause this video and go and have a look at that one. I think it's only 10 minutes long. Okay. Then we have the reading. It's called Reason and Argument. It's an excerpt. It's on the Moodle under Readings. I also think it's on the Moodle under Week 6. And then we have this lecture, which is about evaluating arguments. So from the pre-lecture video, we know how to recognize arguments. We know how to represent them in standard form, or as I'll be saying, we know how to formalize informal arguments. But now we need to know how to evaluate them, and that means, what should we look for when evaluating whether or not an argument is rationally compelling? So these are the utter basics from the pre-lecture video. And this is really just a paraphrase, barely a paraphrase, of the excerpt, the reading for the week. If we have a belief that we can support with reasons, belief and reason should be emphasized, so I'll go with vocal emphasis. If we have a belief that we can support with reasons, then we are in possession of an argument for that belief. So the reasons for that belief, for our belief, are called the premises of the argument. The belief which the premises are intended to support is called the conclusion of the argument. Okay, so let's start to look at some examples, because although this is very simple, when we come to try to determine whether an argument is or is not rationally compelling, and we'll have better words for that in a moment, or more technical words for rationally compelling argument in a second, things get quite tricky. Not so with George Bush. I mean, when I was growing up, George W. Bush was the laughing stock, and also quite frightening. Now we have Trump, who outdoes him so catastrophically. It's remains hard to imagine, constantly surprising. But this is what George W. Bush said in trying to legitimate or justify or argue for his belief that we should go to war in Iraq as some kind of retribution for the horrific attacks on 9/11. And this is what he says. This is crazy. You're siding with the terrorists because, you're either with us or you're with those gosh darn terrorists. So he's a Christian. He's not going to say anything more than gosh darn. And your critical attitude clearly suggests that you're not with us. I don't know what that picture's from. Okay, so let's formalize his argument. And again, this is just going off the pre-lecture video. So what we're doing when we're formalizing an argument, the first thing we need to recognize, and this wasn't stressed in the pre-lecture video, is there's no ready-made formula for turning an argument that someone says in ordinary speech into philosophical form or logical form, P1, P2, and so on, and a conclusion. What we need to look out for are verbal clues or inference indicators, as the pre-lecture video had it. In this case, it's because. If someone says because, or as such, something like that, or I can't think of any other examples at the moment. Because is the best one, obviously. You know that someone is providing reasons or premises to support their conclusion. And in this case, as people often do, he leads with the conclusion. So you are siding with the terrorists as his conclusion, and then because supplies the premises that back that argument up. Okay, so formalizing it, it goes something like this. Premise 1, either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. Premise 2, you're not with us. I have to take a long sip of tea before I go on because it's just so startlingly foul an argument. You are with the terrorists. That would be the conclusion. We might ask ourselves, is this a compelling argument? Well, let's start with the premises. Is premise 1 acceptable? Is it backed up by empirical evidence? Well, in this case, the idea that there were only two positions to take on the Iraq War, that either you could be for the Iraq War or you could support terrorist attacks like those on 9/11, just was simply not true of the American populace. There are a lot of people who are very outspoken in both denouncing terrorist attacks, but also in opposing the move to go to war on Iraq. And so premise one doesn't look acceptable to us. There's something empirically inaccurate about that claim. He seems to suggest that, and we can look at this from a more logical perspective, he seems to suggest that being with us, and by that he means those who want to go to war in Iraq, or being with the terrorists, saturate all possible political positions in America at the time. And we call that a disjunctive syllogism. Either this or that and nothing else. But that's just not the case. There are many other logical positions that one can take. And again, as I said, being against both, neither nor. Neither with us in the sense of with those who want to go to war in Iraq, nor with the terrorists. So that argument's not compelling for that reason, just because premise one is a doozy. Here's another example. This is from Our Watch, which is a national anti-violence initiative. I think I've got their website there. So in 2017, they released empirical evidence suggesting that some people who rigidly adhere to stereotypical gender roles are more likely to condone violence against women. And then someone might come along and say, well, therefore my grandma is likely to condone violence against women. So let's try and formalize this argument. Okay, so according to the National Violence Initiative, Our Watch, empirical evidence suggests that, and here's the premise, some people who rigidly adhere to stereotypical gender roles are more likely to condone violence against women. Therefore, grandma is likely to condone violence against women. So we've got a clear premise one. Some people, and this will be important in philosophy, when we say some, we mean more than one. So more than one person who rigidly adheres to stereotypical gender roles are more likely, and it's a very weak, not a weak claim, perhaps that's the best way to put it, it's a weak claim, and they're not saying that all people, they're not saying necessarily, they're just saying more than one person who has stereotypical gender roles is more likely, not necessarily, to condone violence against women. And they're not saying conduct violence against women, they're just saying to condone it. So we might say premise one is acceptable in the sense that it's backed up by empirical evidence. I mean, it says there, Our Watch, empirical evidence suggests that. It's a suggestion, or a premise rather, that we'd be happy, I think, to take on board. The problem with this argument is that grandma just appears out of nowhere, or rather not with the argument, but with the argument as it's stated in ordinary speech. We've got this first premise and then a conclusion that jumps to grandma. So what we need to do is supply an unstated premise, that's the UP1, that makes explicit what is implicitly being said about grandma in the argument that's being made. So obviously they're saying here that grandma is someone who rigidly adheres to stereotypical gender roles, because that would link up P1 with this conclusion. Grandma is likely to condone violence against women. I should say, look, if when you're looking for inference indicators, therefore is as good as because. So if because clearly introduces premises, well then therefore clearly introduces one's conclusion. So we've had to supply UP1, an unstated premise, in order to make the argument make sense, to not jump from a premise to a conclusion that has a premise built into it. The problem with this argument, I think, is that the conclusion doesn't seem to properly recognize or take into account the some people that starts the premise. They don't say all people, they just say some people. And the argument seems to assume that it's all people because grandma would be one of those people and therefore necessarily is more likely to condone violence against women. But grandma might be one of those people with stereotypical gender roles who is outside of that group of some people. She's one of those people who has stereotypical gender roles or adheres to them, but does not condone violence against women. So the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. The premises don't support the conclusion. I mean, even if, and this will be important, premise one and unstated premise one are correct. Like, as I was saying, premise one, there's a lot of, our watch seems to have done empirical evidence. The claim is not a particularly difficult claim to accept. And my grandma certainly rigidly adheres to stereotypical gender roles and is often quite concerned when my partner and I don't fulfill them. But nonetheless, the conclusion doesn't follow from those otherwise acceptable premises. And so we're unlikely, we don't find it rationally compelling. So there are two conditions for a successful argument, for a rationally compelling argument. And arguments would fail if they don't meet these conditions. Conversely, we would say that an argument is sound, that's some technical language, if it meets both of these conditions. So before the last few slides, we've been talking about how arguments might fail to be rationally compelling, sort of general terms. Now we're introducing some technical terminology, these conditions and the idea of soundness, that, well, it's philosophical lingo that we would like you to start to try and use, and certainly try to use in AT3. So the first condition that an argument must satisfy, if it's to be true, or if it's to be sound rather, is truth. And an argument meets this requirement, the requirement of truth, if we can accept all of its premises as true, if its premises are acceptable. So if you think about our first example of George Bush, we weren't able to accept his first premise as true. The second condition is cogency. An argument is cogent if the premises give good support to the conclusion. And so if you think about a second example, the empirical research conducted by our watch, both of the premises that certain people are likely to condone gender violence and that grandma has stereotypical gender roles, both of those we could accept as true. But nonetheless, the conclusion wasn't supported properly by the premises. It didn't follow from the premises, is another way of putting it. So the cogency of an argument, and this is important, has nothing to do with actual truth of premises. Rather, it's that if the premises were true, then they would give us good reason to accept the conclusion. And I'll give an example of this now. So what this means is that we can assess the cogency of an argument independently of assessing its truth, and vice versa. So what do I mean by this? Let's look at an argument. Okay, so the premise, and ask ourselves what's wrong with it. So the first premise would be all Democrats are advocates of the welfare state. Donald Trump is a Democrat. Conclusion, Donald Trump is an advocate of the welfare state. So we can ask ourselves, what's wrong with this argument? Is it A, even if the premises were true, they would not support the conclusion? Or is it B, at least one of the premises is false? Or is it both A and B? So pause your video now while I have a sip of tea and ask yourself which one you think it might be. Delightful. The answer is B, because the premises, if they were true, would necessarily lead to the conclusion. I mean, the premises are false. I mean, both of them are false. I mean, it's obvious that premise 2 is false. Donald Trump is not a Democrat. Everyone knows that, in any sense of the word. But he's not a member of the Party of Democrats. But premise 1, I mean, it would be hard to establish that all Democrats are advocates of the welfare state. I won't name names, but it's possible to be a Democrat and be out to dismantle the welfare state. But even if you didn't know that, it's pretty clear that at least premise 2 is false. But if this argument had true premises, if in some possible world all Democrats were advocates of the welfare state and Donald Trump were a Democrat, then it would be true that Donald Trump is an advocate of the welfare state. The conclusion follows or is supported by the premises. It's just unfortunately in this case, the premises are untrue. So it's a cogent argument, but it's untrue. So it's not sound, but not because it's not cogent. It's unsound because its premises aren't true. Okay, so the thing about cogency is that it's a matter of degree. So cogency can be a weak link between a premise or between premises and conclusion. Cogency can be a strong link between premise and conclusion. Now, what do I mean by this? Here's example A. Premise 1, the victim had trolley masks on her chest. Conclusion, the victim was run over by an alien spacecraft. Now, that's a very weak link between premise and conclusion. But it's not non-cogent because it is possible. If it's the case that alien spacecraft run on tram wheels, if there were a second premise specifying that alien spacecraft run on tram wheels, well then we would be able to legitimately infer from that premise that the victim was run over by an alien spacecraft, or that it was at least possible for them to be so run over. But here's a stronger link. The victim had trolley marks on her chest. The victim was run over by a trolley. It's a much stronger link because we know just from looking at the detail of the premise and the conclusion, the content of the premise and the conclusion, that there's a link between the two. We don't need another premise stating that alien spacecraft have trolley wheels in order to support our conclusion. I just want to talk about maximal cogency for a second. So this was the argument we just had. But if we were to spell out the argument in this way, well, then we would have something like what we'll call validity, and I'll go on it, which is kind of maximal support or a necessary relationship between premise and conclusion. So premise 1, if the victim had trolley marks on her chest, then she was run over by a trolley. Premise 2, the victim had trolley marks on her chest, the victim was run over by a trolley. So you can see that it necessarily follows, if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, that the victim was run over by a trolley. There's no way to move. There is no possible world, when I say no way to move, that doesn't make any sense. There's no way to wriggle out of the conclusion. If the premises are true, there is no possible world in which the conclusion could be false, because premise 1 rules out that trolley marks could be caused by anything other than being run over by a trolley. So if those premises are true, if we accept them, well then we have to come to the conclusion that the victim was run over by a trolley. So maximal cogency is called validity. Right. So what I want to do now is there's lots of, we have two operators. We have the idea of truth and we have the idea of cogency. And there's 4 possible ways, and I'll run through them now, in which these two can interact, because we've already noted that it's possible to assess arguments on the basis of their truth, from the criteria of their truth and the criteria of their, criterion of their cogency, independently of one another. And that means we have 4 possible examples, or 4 possible ways in which these two conditions of sound argument can interact or be presented in an argument. So the first one would be true premises and a cogent structure. So premise 1, if Melbourne is in Victoria, then Melbourne is in Australia. Well, that's true. Melbourne is in Victoria, therefore Melbourne is in Australia. So the premises are true, and the conclusion logically follows. If Melbourne is in Australia, then it necessarily follows that Melbourne is in... if Melbourne is in Victoria, it necessarily follows that Melbourne is in Australia. Then we get it specified in what we'll call the minor premise. Don't worry about that. That Melbourne is in Victoria, then it necessarily follows that Melbourne is in Australia. Wonderful. Wonderful reasoning. Here we have, however, a cogent structure, but a false premise. So if Melbourne is in Egypt, then Melbourne is in Africa. Melbourne is in Egypt, therefore Melbourne is in Africa. So again, to use, I guess I'll have to use the technical word, this is counterfactual reasoning. And we saw this already with the Donald Trump as a Democrat example. If Melbourne were in Egypt, if its first premise were true, then this argument would be sound. It would make perfect sense. If Melbourne is in Egypt, then it follows that Melbourne is in Africa. The argument unpacks that initial premise perfectly cogently. It's just that unfortunately, when we check the argument not for cogency but for truth, the argument is unsound because Melbourne's not in Egypt. Okay, then we have a third example, or a third possible combination of the conditions of truth and cogency. This starts to get complicated. Premise 1. If Melbourne is in New South Wales, then Melbourne is in Australia. Premise 2. Melbourne is not in New South Wales. Melbourne is not in Australia. So what's gone wrong there? I mean, both premises are true because New South Wales is in Australia and Melbourne is not in Australia. Melbourne is not in New South Wales, rather. So premise 1 is true, premise 2 is true. Right? But the problem with the argument, it's not unsound because the conclusion is false, though it is, and the conclusion is false, but because of the relationship or connection between the premises and the conclusion. Remember, cogency checks for the relationship or the connection between premises and conclusion to see if the conclusion is supported by premises. In this case, the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. Just because Melbourne is not in New South Wales doesn't mean it's not in Australia. The premises don't provide enough content for us to justifiably infer in the conclusion where Melbourne is when it's not in New South Wales. Okay, then we've got a fourth example where everything is wrong. So the previous example, we had true premises, but a failure of cogency, a failure to meet the standard or condition of cogency. Here, everything's gone wrong. False premises and a lack of cogency. If Melbourne is in New South Wales, then Melbourne is in Africa. Melbourne is in Africa. Melbourne is in New South Wales. I don't know about you, but this kind of hurts the brain. I mean, the premises are completely false. But even if they were true premises, the argument would not be cogent because in this possible world, there are other places in Africa besides New South Wales. So according to the premises, even if they were true, one could be in Africa and not in New South Wales. You see, it gets it round the wrong way. Okay. So summing up the idea of soundness. A sound argument is a cogent argument with true premises, an argument that meets both of those conditions. So, and this is the one that you'll often get, all human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being. Socrates is mortal. And if you think back that all Democrats support the welfare state, Trump is a Democrat, therefore he supports the welfare state, follows the same structure. Right, any questions? Again, if you have any questions, we can talk about this on Thursday between 10 and 1, or you can send me an email, of course. So I said there were two conditions for soundness. There's actually a third. But as a true pedagogue, I left the complication out until now. So the third condition is that the argument does not commit any fallacies, is not fallacious. So the first fallacy, I'm going to talk about two. The first fallacy is the fallacy of equivocation. The first premise would be, my grandma worships the one true God of love. And here, this premise, although it's not spelling it out, that means the Christian God. I went to an evangelical school, so the idea that God is love is something that I sung in choir every Thursday. So it doesn't strike me as odd to understand by that claim that my grandmother worships the Christian God. Shawn Mendes is the one true God of love. Now, this used to say Zac Efron, but I've updated it to Shawn Mendes, not because I know anything about Shawn Mendes, he just happened to be in The Guardian today, and apparently he's the new teenage heartthrob. Zac Efron's getting too old to be a legitimate object of teenage lust. But what this is being said here, what is being said in premise 2, is, well, the same words are used, one true God of love, but in a completely different meaning. This is a teenage girl or boy saying Shawn Mendes is my heartthrob, is the one true God of love. And then, given this ambiguity in the meaning of the sentence one true God of love, the argument goes on to conclude with my grandma worships Shawn Mendes. So this is the definition of the fallacy of equivocation. It happens when the premises rely on the double meaning in order to be true, and yet the argument relies on the same word or phrase having only one meaning in order to be cogent. So to meet the truth condition, this argument uses the phrase or the formula or the definition, one true God of love, in two very different ways from two very different perspectives. So from a certain perspective, it is true that my grandma worships the one true God of love, the Christian God. From a certain perspective, it is true that the teenager worships what they take to be the one true God of love, their love, Shawn Mendes. But then, when it attempts to conclude, and I say attempts to conclude, I mean it does conclude, but it concludes illegitimately, it then reverts to the first meaning of one true God of love. Because now we have this idea that my grandmother is worshipping Shawn Mendes as if she were worshipping the Christian God. So to try and explain this a little bit more, this is the argument that we had. Let's try to remove the ambiguity by defining, or the equivocation rather, by defining one true God of love when we use it in each of the premises. So my grandma worships a Christian's notion of God. Shawn Mendes is a love God for many teenagers. I don't know if anyone uses that phrase for many teenagers. And then the conclusion would be my grandma worships Shawn Mendes. And once we've removed the equivocation by properly defining what we mean by one true God of love in each of the premises, well then we have a non-cogent argument. Even though both of the premises are true, we can see now that we've taken the time to properly define our terms, there's no logical connection at all between Shawn Mendes' status, sorry, I got the apostrophe wrong there, status as an object of teenage desire, and my grandmother's Christian worship. I mean, those two facts in no way support the conclusion that my mother has, bought a pair of Calvin Klein underpants and is now worshipping at the altar of the eminently desirable Shawn Mendes. The second fallacy is begging the question. So begging the question is often said to mean, well, you've said something and it's piqued my interest, you're inviting further questions, or there are certain questions that now need to be asked given the information you've offered. So like to think of an example from sports, given that a certain football club continues to commit crimes of some kind, domestic abuse or drug abuse or similar, it begs the question what kind of locker room culture they have, or what kind of staff culture they have at that managerial culture, I should say, they have at that particular football club. But that's not what we mean in philosophy when we say begging the question. And once you get used to using it in the philosophical sense, anyone who says begging the question in the ordinary sense is quite jarring. So in philosophy, to beg the question, it means presupposing the conclusions that you want to prove in the premises themselves. So the example here, and this is not to say that Christianity has no value or merit, just that this particular argument begs the question. So the Bible can be trusted as the Word of God. The Bible says that God exists, therefore God exists. So the problem here is that premise 1 presupposes that God exists, because he must exist in order to have a word. So you can build that presupposition back into premise 1 and then see how circular the argument really is. The Bible can be trusted as the Word of God who exists insofar as he has a word. Premise 2, the Bible says that God exists, but that now becomes superfluous. See, God exists. You could just have premise 1 and it would just be an assertion. The Bible can be trusted as the Word of God who, because he has a word, exists. Not even the because. You don't even need the because. The Bible can be trusted of the Word of God as the Word of God who exists. Okay. So here are some take-home messages. Today's question was, how do we assess whether or not an argument is rationally compelling? The answer is, when we put everything together, we look to see if the argument is sound, and that means, does it meet the conditions of cogency and truth? And 2, we need to see if it commits any fallacies, in this case of equivocation and begging the question. And next week, we'll come back to killing, in this case, the killing of animals. Thanks very much for listening. And again, do send me any emails if you have any questions. And do come to my office hour, extended office hour from 10 to 1 on Thursday. And wish me luck on the strike. Thanks very much.